We'll begin with the move e4. For reference, all the openings we explore here will start with e4, as it provides strong attacking chances and the highest win probabilities. After e4, if black responds with e5, we'll continue with knight f3. If black then plays knight c6, we aim for d4, entering the Scotch game. In most cases, your opponent will capture the pawn with e takes d4, as it's the dominant and most logical response. If they don't, there aren't many other effective alternatives they can play. Now, let's examine our first line, knight g5. At first glance, this move seems unusual. While we've seen similar ideas in other openings, often with a bishop on c4 targeting f7, here the goal is still to attack f7. Just in a less conventional way. A reasonable response from black would be h6, attempting to drive the knight back. However, instead of retreating the knight, as most would expect with king f3, we'll go bold and play knight takes f7, sacrificing the knight. At first, this move might look terrible. After all, the king captures the knight and black is up a whole piece. But this sacrifice exposes black's king, giving us significant counterplay. After king takes f7, we follow up with bishop c4. Continuing the attack, black will most likely play king e8 in this position, though other responses are possible. If they choose to retreat to king e7, the position remains slightly better for black, but with their king on e7, you'll still have excellent attacking opportunities. Moves like bringing the queen to h5 or f3, castling, playing rook e1, or pushing pawns give you plenty of space and keep their king awkwardly placed. Even with accurate play, black must execute a series of top-tier engine moves to survive, which is highly unlikely in practical games. Surprisingly, the most common response by far is king d8, even though it's a significant mistake. From here, you can immediately punish black with queen h5. At this point, black is in deep trouble. They might try to delay their fate with g6, but you simply capture the pawn with queen takes g6 check, forcing king e7. Then, you play queen f7, driving the king to king d6. From here, it's a forced mate in 3 moves. The cleanest continuation is e5, which sets up a beautiful finish. If black captures with the king, you deliver a stunning checkmate with queen f4, where the bishop guards the queen, and both pieces dominate the critical squares. If they capture with the knight, you play queen d5, forcing king e7, followed by queen takes e5 checkmate. If the king moves to c5, you play queen d5 check, and regardless of where they go next, queen b5 ends the game elegantly. This sequence demonstrates a decisive and satisfying conclusion to your attack. In any case, the game often ends beautifully, though it's not guaranteed. As mentioned earlier, if black avoids king e8 and instead plays king e7, the position becomes slightly better for them. However, it's still a playable position with plenty of attacking chances. Despite this, the vast majority of players opt for king e8, making your attack highly effective in most games. Now, let's move on to our second opening. Once again, we start with e4 e5, and after knight f3 knight c6, we return to the Scotch game. This time, instead of the bold king g5, we'll go for a more solid and reliable continuation, bishop c4. This leads to what's commonly known as the Scotch gambit. Among Scotch players, this is a highly respected and sound approach. The most natural response from black is bishop c5, guarding the central pawn. To this, you play c3, preparing to challenge black's sender and continue developing your position. Most players will capture the pawn with dx-c3, which is one of the strongest continuations. Your response is to play bishop takes f7 check, sacrificing the bishop. If black declines to recapture, their king will look awkward, and you'll simply retreat your bishop, gaining a strong positional advantage. However, most opponents will take the bishop, and after king f7, you play queen d5 check, simultaneously attacking the king and the unprotected bishop. This forces black to move their king, and the most common response is king e8, which is also the best move. At this point, instead of immediately taking the bishop, you can throw in an extra check with queen h5 check, pressuring black to play g6. While king f8 is technically better, most players opt for g6, setting up an important weakness. After g6, you capture the bishop with queen takes b5. Now, if black plays something like d6, the best move, you continue with queen takes c3, solidifying your position. If instead black tries to capture your pawn on b2, there's no problem, your bishop on the long diagonal remains strong, and you can deal with the pawn later. If they push c2, you can simply capture it when needed. The dark square weakness created by g6 now becomes a critical issue for black. Most players will try to resolve this by developing their knight with knight f6. At this point, you don't need to rush into moves like bishop g5, as it isn't immediately forcing. Instead, you can calmly castle, keeping flexibility in your attack. Playing bishop g5 later can still pressure black to defend the knight, but you have the option to wait and prioritize other moves. There's no immediate win in this position, but you have plenty of strong attacking options. Moves like bishop h6 can prevent black from castling, while bishop g5 applies direct pressure on the pinned knight. You also have the possibility of rook e1, preparing e5 to open up the center. These options give you a dynamic position with good attacking chances. Let's explore a hypothetical line based on common and strong moves. If black plays bishop g4, you could choose between bishop h6 and bishop g5. Bishop g5 is often the better choice since it's more forcing. If black wants to save the knight, they might play rook f8, which is realistic. Note that black cannot castle anymore, as their king has already moved, so you don't need to worry about that. Next, you develop with knight d2, supporting e4 and preparing potential ideas like e5 or knight e4. This also connects your rooks, allowing you to bring one to e1. Black might respond with queen e7, aiming to challenge your e5 push. You can proceed with e5 anyway. If black captures the pawn, you recapture confidently. They'll likely hesitate to take back with the queen since doing so allows you to bring a rook to e1, pinning the queen to the king. If they capture with the knight instead, you can still put a rook on e1, maintaining pressure and exploiting the exposed position of their king. With their king stuck in the center and your pieces well coordinated, you have a strong initiative and plenty of ways to keep the attack alive. It doesn't really matter which rook you use in this position, but let's assume you go with the logical choice. You'll soon capture the pinned knight, as black has no effective way to defend it. They might want to play knight d7, but that knight is also pinned, leaving them with no escape. Once you capture the knight, black is left with a significant problem. The alignment of their queen and king is highly vulnerable. This position is completely winning for you. Of course, there's no guarantee the game will follow this exact sequence, but if it does, you'll be in an excellent position. Now, let's move on to our third opening. Starting with e4 e5. We'll deviate on move 2. Instead of playing knight f3 leading into knight c6, we'll try bishop c4. This is an unusual choice and likely unfamiliar to most opponents. Even those who recognize bishop c4 will probably expect follow-ups like queen f3 or queen h5, aiming for a scholar's mate. Don't worry, we're not going for that. After bishop c4, black will likely respond with nf6. You then continue with knight c3, followed by knight c6 from black. At this point, you play d3, and black might develop with bishop c5. If you were to play knight f3 now, the game would transition into a standard Italian game, but that's not our plan. Instead, we go for something more aggressive, f4. Playing f4 here is fascinating because it puts immediate pressure on black's center. If they capture the pawn, you're happy to see it. Removing their central pawn allows your bishop to enter the game, helping with development and disrupting their center. However, most players won't take the pawn. Instead, they'll likely play d6, which is both logical and the best move. From here, you follow up with f5, gaining space and cramping black's position. Black will likely castle, but by this point, you already have a very promising position with great attacking potential. You play bishop g5, pinning the knight, a classic and effective idea. While this isn't a traditional Italian game, the theme is familiar, pinning the knight and setting up threats like knight d5, which attacks the pinned piece. If you capture the knight with check and black recaptures, their pawns become doubled, an advantageous structure for you. Black will likely respond with h6, and here you have two options. You could simply retreat the bishop, maintaining your knight d5 threat. If black wants to defend, they'll likely maneuver with knight b8 or knight d7, and they'll be just in time to defend. This line is solid and perfectly fine. However, there's a more aggressive and surprising option, sacrificing the bishop with play h6. This unexpected move can lead to a lot of quick wins. Most players will find it hard to resist capturing the bishop. After black takes g5, you recapture, opening the h-file for your rook and setting up a devastating attack. From here, the plan is straightforward. Play queen h5 once the knight moves, typically to knight h7. And the game is effectively over. Thanks for watching.